officer sent in recent letters. Those letters and other information are available at the shielding section of the mygov.scot website. The Chief Medical Officer's advice means that if you are on the shielding list and you live in part of Scotland currently in level 4, that of course includes the whole of mainland Scotland, you should not go into work even if you have had one or indeed both doses of the vaccine. We will of course update you as and when this advice changes. I mentioned last week that we believe vaccination is already helping to reduce the number of people dying with COVID in our care homes. Last week's report from National Records of Scotland provided early evidence for that view, and yesterday the University of Edinburgh reported the initial results of a survey into COVID hospitalisations. It found that by the 4th week after a first dose being administered, the Pfizer and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines reduced the risk of hospitalisation from COVID by 85% and 94% respectively. That is extremely welcome and very encouraging news. The early evidence on the impact of vaccination on transmission of the virus, including that published by Public Health England yesterday, is also extremely encouraging. So while our watchwords at this stage continue to be caution and patience, there is little doubt that we now have much firmer grounds for optimism that vaccination and the other tools at our disposal do offer us a route back to greater normality. Of course, it is by being cautious, careful and patient for the next period while the vaccination programme has time to progress that we will make that route as safe and sustainable as possible. Taking the brakes off too quickly will allow the virus to get ahead of us again and put our progress out of lockdown into reverse. I appreciate that this can be, indeed is, a frustrating message, but it is an essential one. The point is underlined when we consider the current state of the pandemic. On the one hand, we can and should take heart from the fact that the lockdown measures adopted after Christmas have had an impact. In the first week of January, an average of 300 new cases a week were being recorded for every 100,000 people in the population. That has fallen by almost 2/3. The figure is now just above 100. We're also now seeing lower test positivity rates and fewer COVID patients in both hospital and intensive care. But on the other hand, there are some signs that the decline in case numbers is slowing down. Last week, in fact, we recorded hardly any reduction at all. That is likely linked to the fact that the more transmissible new variant of the virus now accounts for more than 85% of all cases. And the greater transmissibility of the new variant means it is harder to suppress. So although the R number is currently below 1, it might not be very far below it, and it would likely not take very much easing right now to push it back above 1. As I said, we are very hopeful, indeed increasingly hopeful, that vaccination will have a significant impact on the R number, but that will take a bit more time. So the bottom line, and this is the clear message from our clinical advisors, is that we have quite limited scope at this stage for easing restrictions. And of course, we have just made one significant relaxation of lockdown. Yesterday, children returned to early learning in childcare settings, and pupils in primaries 1 to 3 returned to school. Some secondary school students are also now going back to school for essential practical work. So it's important that we see what impact that has on transmission before we commit to further relaxation. In short, our current position I would summarise as extremely positive and promising, and we should all take heart from that, but still quite precarious, and if we are to sustain our progress, we do need to exercise care and caution. If we're to minimise the impacts of COVID while maximising our ability to live unrestricted lives, we must get the virus to as low a level as we can and try to keep it there. And that's not some kind of ideological goal. We know from experience that it's when the virus is allowed to simmer at relatively high levels in the community that the risk of it accelerating out of control and causing more illness is most acute. And that is also when the risk of the virus mutating and new variants emerging, which could undermine our vaccines, is greatest. So maximum suppression is important for our chances of getting back to normal. So that's the context in which we are today publishing the updated strategic framework. The framework has been discussed with business organisations, trade unions, the third sector and others. I know that other parties took part in discussions at the weekend. There will be further discussions over the next couple of weeks as we put further flesh on the plans that we are setting out today. We intend to publish a further document in mid-March giving more detail beyond that I am able to set out today on the sequencing of reopening the economy from late April onwards. However, today we set out the overall approach to and an indicative timescale for easing restrictions over the next few weeks, with a view to more substantial reopening, particularly of the economy, from late April. In considering the framework, I think is helpful to bear this in mind. At the moment, and for a bit longer, we need to rely very heavily on restrictions to suppress the virus. That's essential when it is so transmissible and when case numbers are still quite high. But in time, once the vast majority of the adult population has received at least one dose of the vaccine, we do hope that vaccination will become our main tool for suppression. However, the months between now and then will be something of a transition as we gradually rely less and less on restrictions and more on vaccination. In order to manage that transition successfully and so that we can start easing restrictions before the full impact of vaccination kicks in, we need to use a range of other measures too. Our test and protect system will continue to be vital in breaking chains of transmission as they arise. That's why we're supporting more people to self-isolate when they need to, and it's why we're expanding testing capacity so that we can test more people at work, especially in key public services and critical infrastructure roles, and so that we can use targeted community testing more, especially in areas where there seems to be stubbornly high prevalence of the virus. Travel restrictions are also essential and are likely to remain so for some time yet. We saw over the summer how new cases were imported into Scotland after the virus had almost been eliminated here, and we don't want to have that happen again if we can avoid it. In particular, we want to guard against importation of new variants of the virus, which could be more resistant to the vaccines that we're currently using. So the strategic framework rightly emphasises the importance of both travel restrictions and test and protect. They will both help us to ease restrictions safely. So let me turn now to the priorities for and the indicative timeframe for easing restrictions. As I have already emphasised, the strategic framework is deliberately cautious at this stage, but I want to be clear that in the coming weeks, if the data allows and positive trends continue, we will seek to accelerate the easing of the restrictions. However, the framework today provides detail on what, as of now, we expect our next changes to be. Firstly, it confirms that, if all goes according to plan, we will move fully back to a level system from the last week in April. At that stage, we hope that all parts of the country currently in level 4 will be able to move out of level 4 and back initially to level 3, possibly with some revision to the content of the levels, and afterwards to levels dependent on incidence and prevalence of the virus at that time. The advantages of the level system, of course, is that it will allow us to let some parts of the country move faster than others if the data supports that. Moving back to the variable level system at that time will also be contingent on us having vaccinated all JCVI priority groups 1 to 9, which, as I said earlier, we hope to have done by mid-April. That matters not only because these groups will be more protected, but also because we believe that vaccinating around half of the population will have a significant effect on reducing transmission across society as a whole. And although we don't yet know exactly how big an effect that will be, we do hope and believe it will give us the headroom to carefully ease restrictions. It is therefore from the last week of April that we would expect to see phased but significant reopening of the economy, including non-essential retail, hospitality and services like gyms and hairdressers. And of course, the more of us who are vaccinated and the more we all stick by the rules now, the faster that safe pace is likely to be. If we all stay in this together, our progress will be greater. As I said earlier, we will set out more detail in mid-March on the indicators that will guide our decisions on levels, as well as on any revision to the content of each level, and will take account of our experience and of sectoral views, and also the order in which we expect those parts of the economy that have been restricted to start reopening from the last week of April. I want now, though, to set out the journey from here to the end of April. We envisage a progressive easing of the current level 4 restrictions that apply across most of the country at intervals of at least 3 weeks, along with changes nationally on education and care home visiting, and the immediate priority will continue to be the return of schools. All of these easings will, of course, depend on an assessment that it is safe to proceed. The first easing started yesterday with the partial return of schools. In addition, universities and colleges are able to bring back a small number of students, no more than 5% of the total, where face-to-face teaching is critical. We will also ease restrictions on care home visiting from early March, and guidance was set out at the weekend. The next phase of easing will be a minimum of 3 weeks later, so indicatively from March the 15th. We hope that this will include the next phase of school return, which will start with the rest of primary school years, 4 to 7, and also getting more senior phase secondary pupils back in the classroom for at least part of their learning. We also hope in this phase to restart outdoors non-contact group sports for 12 to 17-year-olds, and we will also aim to increase the limit on outdoor mixing between households to 4 people from a maximum of 2 households, compared to 2 people from 2 households just now. And then a minimum of 3 weeks after that, so from the 5th of April, it is our hope and expectation at this stage that the stay-at-home restriction will be lifted. We would aim for any final phase of school return to take place on this date. Communal worship will also, we hope, restart around the 5th of April, albeit with restricted numbers to begin with. However, in deciding the exact date for this, we will obviously take account of the timing of major religious festivals, for example, Easter and Passover, so it may be a few days earlier when communal worship can restart. And we will seek to ease the restrictions on household gatherings further, so that at least 6 people from 2 households can meet together. In this phase, we will also begin the reopening of retail. That will start with an extension of the definition of essential retail and the removal of restrictions on click and collect. And then 3 weeks after that, as I indicated earlier, so from the 26th of April, assuming the data allows it, we will move back to levels with hopefully all of Scotland that is currently in level 4, moving to level 3, albeit with some possible modifications. And at that stage, we will begin to reopen the economy and society in the more substantial way that we are all longing for. It is, of course, important for me to stress that all of this depends on us continuing to suppress the virus now and continuing to accept some trade-offs for a period, for example, on international travel. But if we do so, I am very optimistic that we can make good progress in returning more normality to our lives and to the economy. I know this is still a cautious approach, which, though absolutely essential to control the virus and protect health, is nevertheless extremely difficult for many businesses. The Scottish Government is committed to continuing support for businesses. For example, provided we receive confirmation of consequentials in the March budget, we will support the Strategic Framework Business Fund until at least the end of June. We will also ensure that when local authority areas move out of level 4, businesses that are allowed to reopen will continue to receive payments from the fund for at least the next 4 weeks as they transition back to trading more normally. We're also considering some form of tapered support for businesses that may still face trading restrictions and reduced demand even as they are allowed to reopen, and the Finance Secretary will set out further details shortly. We will work with business organisations on these and many other issues as we continue to emerge from lockdown. In addition to the concerns of business, I know that people across the country are anxious for as much clarity as possible. I want to give as much as possible today, while avoiding giving false assurance or picking arbitrary dates that have no grounding at this stage in any objective assessment. I am as confident as I can be that the indicative staged timetable that I've set out today, from now until late April, when the economy will start to substantially reopen, is a reasonable one. And in mid-March, when we have made further progress on vaccines and have greater understanding of the impact of the initial phase of school return, I hope we can set out then more detail on the further reopening that will take place over April and May and into a summer when we hope, really hope, to be living with much greater freedoms than we are today. For now, however, the most important priority we still all have is to continue to suppress the virus. And of course, for a bit longer, that means sticking to the current lockdown rules. So please continue to stick to both the letter and the spirit of them. Please stay at home except for essential purposes. For now, don't meet people from other households indoors and follow facts when you are out and about. Please continue to work from home wherever possible. And for employers, please continue to support your employees to work from home. By doing all of this, we will make it easier for children to return to school more quickly, and we can continue to suppress the virus even as we follow this path out of lockdown. And as we do all of this, we can keep each other safe, protect the NHS, while giving the vaccination programme the time to do its work. I know how hard all of this continues to be after 11 long months of this pandemic, but the restrictions are working, the vaccination programme is motoring, and we can now see a firm way out of this. So if we all stick together and stick with it, we are now able to say with confidence that we are looking at much brighter times ahead. So please, for now though, stay at home to protect the NHS and save lives.
Thank you very much. The First Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in their statement. I intend to allow around 40 minutes for the questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. After a year where all our lives have been put on pause, there is finally a growing sense that this might be over soon. And while it's too early to declare anything like victory, we are starting to win the race between the vaccine rollout and the spread of the virus. And we're grateful to all who are delivering the vaccine programme. The Edinburgh University study this week, which found that getting the jab can cut hospital admissions by up to a remarkable 94%, was better than could have been hoped. The success of the vaccine programme means it is now possible to start to have those important conversations with friends and family about reconnecting, about making plans, and about getting all of our lives back on track. And we welcome the information that's contained within this statement today, particularly the details on school return and care home visits. However, there is much that is not in this statement. There is nothing for the thousands of Scots who've had medical treatments, tests or operations cancelled about when and how services will get back up to speed. There's nothing for those who've already postponed huge life events like weddings for a year, about when they can walk down the aisle in front of family and friends. And there's nothing about when measures like social distancing will end and we can do something as basic as give a loved one a hug. The statement and the accompanying documents relate almost exclusively to the time between now and the 26th of April, where the First Minister intends to move the whole country to level 3 restrictions, pandemic permitting, which, to be clear, under current rules would still stop people leaving their council area. But there is nothing about what happens after the 26th of April. This isn't a route map out of COVID, it is a holding document for the next 8 weeks. And everyone understands that we might not be able to give people absolute certainty, but they were expecting the First Minister to give them some kind of hope. Many will have tuned in today precisely because they were expecting to receive that. They didn't tune in today expecting to be told to tune in again in 3 weeks' time, and they have a right to be disappointed. First Minister, why won't you let the people of Scotland know the plan to get them fully out of lockdown and back to their lives?
First Minister.
Firstly, on NHS operations and treatments, NHS remobilisation is underway. The Health Secretary keeps Parliament updated on that. I'll ask her to write to members to give a further update on that as soon as she's able to. On weddings, I would hope that as we go into the period after the end of April, we will be able to see weddings with greater numbers of people, although possibly in likelihood still restricted, taking place. As I have always done, I'm trying to be frank with people, I think we can all be much more hopeful today than we have been able to be throughout this entire pandemic, not just because we have evidence that lockdown is suppressing the virus, but that we have growing evidence that we have an alternative to lockdown restrictions that will suppress the virus instead of lockdown restrictions over the longer term, and that, of course, is vaccination. And that does allow us to say that we think by the time we get to April, we can start to open up the economy, and between now and April, we can open up in a gradual and phased way some aspects of the current restrictions that are in place. But we have to balance that with the reality, and it's not a reality I enjoy, and it's not a reality anybody enjoys, that there is still uncertainty. There is still uncertainty about the impact of the vaccination on transmission, although all of the evidence that is now emerging on that is positive. And we need to make sure that we are not opening up while the virus is still hovering and simmering at levels that are too high for us safely to do that. So the further into the future we go, the reality is any dates that we give at this stage are more arbitrary. It's like, putting your finger in the wind and coming up with a date that is not firmly based in the evidence. And that is the balance that we are seeking to strike. By mid-March, we will have evidence of the impact of the early return of schools, and we will have more evidence, I hope, on the impact of vaccination. So by then we will be able to go forward a little bit more and give more detail in that April into May period. This is all going in the right direction, but this is the moment where we have to be optimistic and positive, but also patient and sensible as well. The last thing I want to be doing at any point, the last thing any of us want to be doing at any point this year is going backwards. This must be a firm and sustainable route out of lockdown, and that is what I believe that we are putting in place.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey.
Can I thank the First Minister for a statement and send my condolences to those who have lost loved ones to COVID. Most people make the reasonable assumption that once you've had your vaccination, particularly the second dose, that you are effectively good to go. But the reality is that you can still get COVID, but hopefully in a much milder form and avoiding hospitalisation. That means that testing is critically important so that we can quickly identify and contain any future outbreaks. So will the First Minister issue a revised testing strategy that includes mass community testing where appropriate to do so? And finally, I want to be optimistic and I am equally patient. But can I ask the First Minister what the ultimate goal is? Because I think it's important that people understand what lies ahead. Is it suppression of the virus using testing, tracing and vaccination, but accepting there is some risk, as we do with flu each year? Or is it elimination with zero COVID and the prospect of continuing restrictions over a longer period, including further lockdown?
First Minister.
I think the document, if my memory serves me correctly, and if it doesn't say it explicitly, it's certainly the intention is to publish a revised testing strategy to take account of our increased capacity and the new strategic objectives for testing as we come out of lockdown. The points about vaccine, that is still, there is more than one unanswered question about the impact of vaccination, but the biggest unanswered question, although it is less unanswered than it was a week ago, is exactly what impact does the vaccines have on stopping people getting and transmitting the virus. Now, the evidence that was published yesterday and the evidence that is emerging from the pharmaceutical companies is really positive, but we still need more data to be certain about that. The fact that it reduces hospitalisation and deaths is clearly good. That's the principal objective of the first phase of the vaccination programme. But of course, if it is still transmitting, then the risk of long COVID, of people still becoming ill, is there. So we need to have more data heading in the same direction as the data so far, giving us that confidence that it is reducing transmission. The more confident we become about that, the more confident we can be that the vaccine will do the job that the rest of us have been doing for the last year of living under restrictions to suppress things. On the point of elimination versus suppression, the point is you've got to try for as close to elimination as possible in order to keep the virus as low as possible. So even if you don't achieve absolutely no COVID, the very act of trying keeps it at levels that are safer for us then to open up. The problem, I think, with the flu analogy, I know what people mean, that we live with flu every year and we will have to live with the fact that COVID is a virus that exists. The problem is COVID, as we know at the moment, for some people, particularly in the shape of long COVID, can be more severe. So being complacent about it, I think, is a really dangerous thing to do. Having a conversation with the Chief Medical Officer this morning, and he used, and I've heard other people use this, that perhaps the better analogy is with measles, where measles is kept firmly under control, but there are outbreaks from time to time that we then have to make sure. So we keep it really contained, really suppressed, and deal with outbreaks. And vaccination, immunisation, does the main job of keeping it under control. I don't think that's a perfect analogy any more than the flu one is, but perhaps it is more accurate. But what's our goal? Our goal is to get back to normal life. Our goal is to be able to hug loved ones. Our goal is to be able to go about our business the way we all want to do. I think we're much closer to that because largely of the vaccination programme than we have been at any point in a year. But we just need to make sure we are doing this sensibly and with an appropriate degree of caution so that before the vaccination is doing all of the work we think it may ultimately do, we're not sending ourselves backwards.
Now, Colin, will you ready?
I think there is broad consensus across the country about the caution required. We must never forget there are many harms, like to mental health and to education, not just COVID. which is why we need to move to ease as soon as we can without allowing the virus to get out of control again. The measures today are broadly similar to the early measures announced by Boris Johnson yesterday, with an earlier phased easing on schools and the 2-person outdoor limit and a slightly later easing on shops, and I support that approach. There have been many false dawns on care home visiting. My hope is that this is not another one and that families separated for months can be safely together again. And finally, I'm concerned that vaccine passports are slowly gaining traction. This is despite the First Minister's scepticism when I asked about it last year. Can we have an assurance from the First Minister that vaccine passports or certificates won't be used to access public services in this country?
First Minister.
I wouldn't support the access of public services being based on anything like that. I do think it's important that we, firstly, don't get caught in any sort of preconceived idea of what people mean, because I think some people, or many people, mean different things when they talk about vaccine passports or vaccine certificates. So we shouldn't close our minds to that. You know, yellow fever certificates exist for travel to some countries. So there may well be scope for vaccination giving you the ability to do certain things that without vaccination you might not be able to do. I agree that there are a lot of things, and I'm not sure there is a huge amount of disagreement, certainly between the different governments in the UK on this. There's a lot of things we need to think through. We need to firstly understand, as I've talked about in other contexts, exactly what vaccination gives you in terms of protection against getting or passing on the virus. And then we do need to think about these ethical issues, about what is it reasonable to say can be accessed with a vaccine certificate if you had that, and what couldn't, because there are some people who, for reasons beyond their own control, can't get vaccinated, and there are other ethical issues that arise from this. So I think it's not straightforward, it's not simple, it's one of these things that there's a real tendency to try to oversimplify, and we should guard against that. So I don't close my mind to this, but I think like everybody else, we want to think through this carefully. And if some kind of mechanism like this can give us some greater normality back at some stage that we wouldn't otherwise get, then let's think about that, but let's think about it properly. And on the other main point that Willie Rennie raised, nobody wants it to be a false dawn on care homes. And one of the things we're saying very clearly just now on care homes, and it applies to schools, because we don't want the children who went back to school yesterday to be out again in a few weeks or a few months, is that's why we've got to do this in a steady but sustainable way, so that the things we are saying are opening up now, we get to keep going in that direction, and that definitely includes care homes.
Thank you. I now call on Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every single one of us just wants this to be over. We would all like nothing better than to get our lives back to normal, and for us to begin tackling the deep harm that's been caused by the dreadful year that we've come through. But the Prime Minister's decision to present specific dates for the lifting of all public health measures 4 months in advance, and to describe these moves as irreversible when we don't yet know what will happen to the virus in future, seems extraordinary. Does the First Minister share my concern that many people, including in Scotland, are already taking the UK government's timeline as a cast iron promise? And looking further ahead, I also want to ask the First Minister about vaccine passports or vaccine status certificates, not just in relation to public services, but their potential use in the wider economy. Does the First Minister believe, as I do, that this could risk making the social inequality we face today even worse, and could set a dangerous precedent for the longer term that people's civil rights can be dependent on their medical history? First Minister.
On the first point, I briefly had the Prime Minister talk this morning, where he certainly presented the 21st of June day as an aspiration, but candidly, and I think rightly, said there were no guarantees. And I think that is a reasonable position to take. I would love to stand here and say that by the 21st of June we'll all be back to normal completely. I can't say that with any certainty at all, because I don't know what the grounding for that is. I don't know what assessment gives confidence of that, which is why Much as I would like to go further out with dates, I don't think it is fair or reasonable to do that right now, because we need to make sure that we have proper assessment and a proper basis for the confidence that the things we are saying might not be able to be guaranteed, but have a reasonably good chance of being deliverable. That's my level of confidence in what I've set out today. By 2 or 3 weeks' time, I hope to have the same level of confidence when we look further into April and perhaps even beyond to May. But I think we've got to continue to treat people like grown-ups in this. People are fed up. We're all fed up with this. We all desperately want it to be over. But I think we all have developed an understanding that it can't be magicked away. We've got to get there in the right way and in a way that is going to prove to be sustainable. On vaccine certificates, passports, whatever you want to call them, I don't have much to add to what I said to Willie Rennie. Suffice to say, yes, I think we should think properly without closing our minds at this stage to what a vaccine passport or certificate might offer us, but I would never support something that deepens social inequalities or put barriers in the way of people accessing public services or took away people's civil liberties in a way that Patrick Harvey sets out. So that really just illustrates why we've got to take care, we've got to think through the practicalities and the ethics of this, and whatever direction we take, make sure that we have a broad consensus across the country behind it.
Thank you. I call Shona Robertson to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you. Today's statement, I think, does give us hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Will the First Minister join me in recognising the extraordinary efforts of NHS Tayside staff in having delivered the first dose vaccination to over 117,000 people? That's more than a third of the adult population in Tayside. Can she also provide any further details about the most recent revised forecasts of the vaccine supply as the rollout continues, so that we can ensure that people complete their first dose, but also that we move on to the second dose as soon as possible?
First Minister.
Well, yes, I certainly do commend the efforts of NHS Tayside and the commitment and hard work of vaccination teams right across the country who are delivering this programme. The limiting factor in the programme at the moment remains supply. We have demonstrated already that we have the ability to vaccinate 400,000 people every week. We would want to increase that even further in the later stages of the programme, but we have to have the supplies of vaccine in order to do that. And the reason our vaccination rate has fallen below that in the past week is because the supplies have not been there to support it. We received updated forecasts of supply late yesterday evening, and our officials are currently doing the analysis and modelling work to understand how we flex the plans based on these forecasts so that we can vaccinate as many people as possible. But assuming the supply based on these updated forecasts allows it, the targets that I've set out today will become the targets we are working to the middle of April for the 1 to 9 groups of the JCVI priority list, everybody over 50, and then the rest of the population by the end of July, which is much earlier than we had originally anticipated. So that would be extremely good news and be very helpful to further easing if that is able to be achieved.
Thank you. Jamie Green to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you. Figures out today show that the percentage of school leavers going on to positive destinations has fallen to its lowest level in 5 years, and the gap between pupils from our most and least deprived communities doing the same has also worryingly increased. So the importance of getting pupils back into the classroom now surely takes on ever more importance and urgency. Can the First Minister confirm by which date, based on her roadmap announced today, she expects all pupils to be back in the classroom? And if, as it seems, that clashes with the start of Easter holidays, are there any plans to alter them?
First Minister.
Well, I said we hope to have the next phase of return to school, and we'll set this out next week, from the middle of March, the 15th of March. That, I would anticipate, at least would be the rest of the primary school years and as many of the senior phase pupils as we deem it is safe to do at that point. But we will have some further work to do before we can set that out in more detail. And then 3 weeks after that would be the final phase of the return to school if we hadn't got all pupils back before then. So that's what we are able to set out right now. The Easter holidays, we will continue to consider how all of this fits with the Easter holidays. But suffice to say, we want to get every young person back into face-to-face education as quickly as possible. We think we will undoubtedly do that with primary before we achieve that for all of the secondary phase in a full-time basis, but as much in-person, face-to-face, in-school education as possible, as quickly as possible, remains our driving imperative.
Willie Coffey, to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you. Can I ask the First Minister if patients with myalgic encephalomyelitis, otherwise known as ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, can be included with those at the highest clinical risk on our shielding list?
First Minister.
I'll double check this because I don't want to give wrong information in response to Willie Coffey's question, but I would assume patients with ME are in the Group 6 category that are currently are starting to be vaccinated now. But I will double check that point and get back to Willie Coffey if it is not correct.
Thank you. Colin Smith, to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Even with the very limited dates given by the First Minister, it won't have escaped businesses that most will not be reopening for many months due to the health restrictions. But there was no real detail in the statement on additional economic support for those businesses. In particular, the First Minister will be aware that the recently launched discretionary funds administered by councils aimed at supporting businesses excluded by other government schemes, such as the Strategic Fund, which the First Minister mentioned, are already very much oversubscribed and limiting payouts. So can I ask the First Minister if consideration is being given to additional support specifically for those discretionary funds which help many businesses that have been left behind by the funds the First Minister mentioned in her statement?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I just repeat, I would be hopeful at this stage that from the last week in April, we will see a significant reopening of businesses across many sectors of the economy. And that is, one of the things that the more successful we are now, we stand to achieve in that timescale. I set out in my opening remarks that we intend to continue the business support that is available through the Strategic Business Framework Fund, assuming the consequentials are confirmed in the budget, until at least the end of June, and further if necessary. We're considering further tapered support. Discretionary funding, which has already been increased in recent weeks, of course, is one of the other factors that the Finance Secretary will be considering continuing and extending should businesses need that for a longer period. But of course, but like my answer on schools, the more we suppress now and vaccinate more now, the sooner we get businesses open and trading properly, because the support that we provide, however important it is, I know most businesses would say is not a substitute for them being able to trade normally.
Maureen Watt, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister what discussions have been had with the UK Government with regards to the continuation of the furlough scheme to reflect the needs of Scotland's approach to exiting lockdown that she has outlined today, and whether any further discussions will take place in light of today's announcement, and if they will consider a tailored approach for specific sectors?
First Minister.
The Finance Secretary will, as she always does, have discussions and make representations to the Chancellor up to the date of the budget in early March. I certainly very much hope that we will hear from the Chancellor a further extension for as long as is necessary of the furlough scheme, because I think that's really important. I think there will be a requirement in England for that, just as there is in Scotland. I think ultimately, as was the case last summer, there will be differences of a couple of weeks perhaps in our timing. In some sectors of coming out of lockdown, there will not be a massive difference in that, so that support is going to be needed. It's also important that we have the ability to tailor support in ways that we think are necessary, depending on the exact shape of the path we take.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Presiding Officer, public compliance is the most important resource that we have in controlling this virus, and the Scottish people are stuck with restrictions and made difficult sacrifices. However, after 11 months of restrictions, people need to see hope that there will be an end point. The First Minister says that in mid-March, the Scottish Government will publish proposals on further easing of restrictions based on a local approach. However, even under level 0 of the old strategic framework, there remains restrictions. And the First Minister confirmed that in mid-March, she will use all the data and evidence she has at her fingertips to give us a full route map for removing restrictions entirely, and say why she is unable to do that right now.
First Minister.
I'll be blunt. I think anybody who stands here right now and says that they can tell you 3, 4, 5 months from now with any certainty that all restrictions, including social distancing, can be lifted, is not doing that on the basis of any objective evidence. I hope that is the case, and I mentioned the need for us to revise as appropriate the content of different levels. I hope, and this is because of vaccinations, I hope that the game changer here that does get us to a position later this year when we are able to have something very, very close to normality is a reality. But anybody who stands here right now, tempting though it is, I'd love to stand here and say, by X date, it's back to 100% normality and COVID is over. But I wouldn't be doing that on any objective basis at all. And I don't think that's fair to people. I think I'd rather stand here. And even if people are a bit frustrated at not getting that kind of information, the information I am giving, I can actually say to people, I've got a reasonable, significant degree of confidence that it is going to be delivered. And that's the approach that I think has served us well, hasn't made life easy over the last year, but I think it's the right approach to continue to try to take.
Patterson, to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
I thank the First Minister for her update and note that rightly no set dates have been given in the new framework for easing lockdown restrictions, although the timescales are easy to see. If the process out today can be accelerated in any way.
First Minister.
My apologies to Patterson. He froze in the middle of his question, so but the screen froze. He didn't freeze, and I missed the middle of it. But I think I got the gist of it, which was if the data allows it, will we accelerate this? Yes, is the answer to that. We're being deliberately cautious right now because we don't have the ability to say with certainty. But if we suddenly get, evidence that vaccination's having a greater effect, or that, we're seeing bigger drops in the virus, we will accelerate accordingly. All of us want to be out of this as quickly as possible. But more than that, I think everybody wants to be out of this sustainably, so that when we come to be looking at next winter, we're not contemplating another lockdown. And that, will continue to mean some trade-offs for a period. Our biggest, or one of our biggest risks right now, are new variants that start to undermine the vaccine efficacy. That would be a terrible development, so that's why we have to be really careful to guard against importation of new variants, hence the need for travel restrictions at the moment.
Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Joan McCall.
First Minister, how will the Scottish Government ensure that care home residents and their families will have access to visits, given that this will depend on an assessment? I can't be alone in having had heartbreaking messages from relatives of care home assessments at residents whose mental health and well-being has been affected by lack of contact. So what support will the Scottish Government provide care home providers to ensure that visiting will both be safe and will happen?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary has been working closely with home care providers to make sure that they have the information, the guidance and the support that's necessary, and that will be an ongoing process. I'll ask the Health Secretary to provide more information to the member about the detail of that and answer any further questions that she has.
Joan McAlpine, to be followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you. Can I warmly welcome the Government's announcement yesterday that all people with a learning disability will now be called for the vaccine in Group 6. Can I ask the First Minister how this information will be conveyed to local health and social care partnerships, and whether we are confident that this group can all be identified through their NHS number?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I think this is an important commitment that we've made previously within Group 6. People with severe learning disabilities were included. We've taken the decision, I think rightly, to include in Group 6 those with mild or moderate learning disabilities as well. Our vaccine team will work on making sure that health boards have what support they need to identify people. When I set out this commitment yesterday, I candidly said that there will be work required to make sure that we are identifying and reaching all those in this group, and health boards working with GPs and working with, in many cases, I think the voluntary sector here are best placed to do that with appropriate support from our vaccine team as necessary.
Edward Mountain, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, there are over 2,000 patients waiting for elective orthopaedic surgery in NHS Highland. Even if operations were being carried out at full capacity, the numbers would still be increasing. 2 weeks ago, a constituent told me that she had been told she would have to wait 6 years for her new knees. First Minister, patients and consultants in the Highlands would like to know how the huge and ever-increasing orthopaedic backlogs will be reduced post the lockdown. Can you tell them?
First Minister.
So this is hugely important, and I don't want anybody to be waiting anything like 6 years for a knee replacement or any other operation. So we've got to do two things. Firstly, we've got to reduce the number of beds and the amount of capacity in our health service right now that has been taken up by COVID. That is why suppressing this virus to the lowest possible levels is really important, because any increase in transmission, again, even if the vaccine is protecting against serious illness and death, still increases the pressure on hospital capacity. So that's another reason why we've got to suppress the virus as far as we can. And then, as we are planning, and this is underway, we have to remobilise and invest in the capacity that will get through the COVID backlog of cases as quickly as possible. And there is a real focus in the Scottish Government in doing that. But I can't emphasise enough the importance of doing that first part, so that we again have a health service that is focused on the wide variety of needs and doesn't have such a significant part of its capacity dedicated to dealing with COVID.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, across Scotland the vaccination programme has been remarkably successful. However, some vulnerable 16 and 17-year-olds at very high risk from COVID-19 have yet to be invited for vaccination, despite the best efforts of parents and guardians. Only the Pfizer vaccine is licensed for this group, which cannot be administered at home or in GP surgeries. What reassurances can be given to this vulnerable group of young people and their families that their circumstances have been fully considered and that they will now be prioritised for vaccination?
First Minister.
Anybody who is eligible for the vaccination will be called for vaccination in the priority that we are following. The Group 6 that is being vaccinated as of this week is a large number of people. It will take some time to get through all of them, but they will all be called. I'll happy to look into the particular point Kenny Gibson is raising and coming back to him in more detail. This is not necessarily the point he's raising. Health Secretary and I were having discussions yesterday with Pfizer, in fact, and talking to them, and I know other pharmaceutical companies are looking at this, at the work that is being done to enable the current vaccines to be extended into the child population as well in due course. So that is work that obviously we're not in control of the timelines of that, but we are optimistic about in the future as well. But I'll come back to Kenny Gibson on this specific point.
Jenny Mara, to be followed by Colin Beat.
Presiding Officer, we have to prepare now for the next couple of years. New COVID variants, as the First Minister said, that may emerge and may require top-up vaccines, possibly depending on the first vaccine received. For that reason, we need to be robust about recording vaccine data, who has received which vaccine, Pfizer or AstraZeneca, date, batch number, etc. Now, our health records are not as digitised as we would like, and we hear stories of people receiving vaccines out with official appointments. Can the First Minister assure me that all of this data is being recorded assiduously for every vaccine administered?
First Minister.
The vaccine management tool that we're using records which vaccine somebody is getting. The Health Secretary is telling me, so I'm taking her word on this, it also records which arm you have the vaccine in. So it's taking and recording the information that is required. There's other things we need to do to guard against new variants, travel restrictions for a period, genomic sequencing, around which the UK is a world leader in terms of genomic sequencing. We are looking at how we do much more real-time genomic sequencing. So if there are new variants in the country, we catch them before they have the chance to become more widespread, and that is going to become increasingly important. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies, and as well as Pfizer yesterday, Health Secretary and I have discussed in the last couple of weeks with AstraZeneca, they are already looking at how they adapt their vaccines as new variants emerge. So lots of complexity here, but this kind of work is going to be really and increasingly important in the years ahead.
Colin Beattie, to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Now, ask First Minister, what measures are being taken to vaccinate those in hospital who are not technically classed as long-term, but are in for prolonged assessment of conditions such as dementia, and whose JCVI target dates have already passed? Several constituents have contacted me, stating that local hospitals have neither supplies nor intention to vaccinate patients in this position.
First Minister.
Again, I'm happy to come back to Colin Beattie with more detail, but the general position in hospitals, I think I covered this in a question last week, is that patients will be vaccinated before they're discharged from hospital. The clinician may decide to wait until the symptoms of whatever it is they're in hospital for abate, so that there's no confusion between any side effects from the vaccine and the symptoms of the illness that they're suffering. But the general position will be that patients are vaccinated before discharge. There will, in all likelihood, be exceptions to that where a clinician thinks that is necessary. But I'll come back to Colin Beattie on more precise detail if I've missed anything in the way of information that is helpful to him.
Brian Whittle, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Coming out of lockdown will inevitably focus attention on the deterioration of the country's mental health, something that was already in a crisis. There is an urgent need to set out a plan that includes support for teachers to deal with pupils returning in a heightened anxiety state, access to enhanced mental health services, including opening up access to third sector services. So can I ask the First Minister if she can tell the Chamber what considerations the Scottish Government has given to a structured plan to tackle the mental health crisis?
First Minister.
We had already, before the pandemic, embarked on plans which have been taken forward now to ensure access for all secondary schools to mental health counsellors, which is an important part of this. There is no doubt that support and provision for mental health, both for children and adolescents, but for the adult population, is going to have to increase in the years to come. The Finance Secretary set out additional funding just last week, and the Mental Health Minister, who has already produced the Mental Health Recovery Plan, will come back to Parliament in due course with further details of how that investment will be spent and the structure that will be put in place to support it.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the important issue of international travel restrictions, can the First Minister advise as to what extent the proposed indicative timetable for the easing of lockdown is predicated on such international travel restrictions remaining in place? And can the First Minister also provide an update as to where ongoing discussions with the UK Government currently stand on the issue of the desirable, more comprehensive approach to international travel quarantine that many of us here in Scotland would wish to see? Thank you.
First Minister.
There have been constructive discussions, mainly at an official level, in the last week or so with the UK Government about ways in which we can work together to try to deal practically with the fact that there is a different approach between Scotland and England. That's welcome, and we hope to continue that. We still favour a common four nations approach in terms of travel restrictions, and we will continue to try to progress that. But as of this moment in time, that's not something that the UK Government is planning to do, as far as I'm aware. On travel restrictions, we don't want them to be in place again for longer than is necessary. I certainly hope that as we go further into the easing of lockdown, one of the things that we can do is ease travel restrictions within Scotland so that loved ones who live in different parts of the country can get together again. We all want that. International travel restrictions, I think, will have to be in place for a bit longer because of the risk of variants and the fact that different parts of the world are at different stages in terms of vaccinating their populations. Unfortunately, no matter how well we do here in Scotland and in the UK with vaccination, we can't get rid of COVID on our own. It's a global illness, so we need to be mindful of what's happening elsewhere in the world. But none of this I want to be in place for a moment longer than is necessary. But as I said last week, we have trade-offs that we need to make over this next period. The more that we accept some restriction on our ability to travel overseas, the greater normality we can get back domestically and get that back quicker than we might otherwise be able to do.
Claire Baker, to be followed by John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm looking for clarity over quarantine rules for travellers. People who arrive in the UK for health treatment, not from a high-risk country, can self-isolate. Can I ask what the rules are for people returning to Scotland who have travelled overseas to receive medical treatment which is not available in the UK and may be self-funded? Often these people will be frail, receiving continuing treatment and medically vulnerable. Do they have to quarantine in a government-approved hotel, or will there be an exemption for people in these circumstances?
There is an exemption in the regulations for people who are travelling for medical treatment and for medical reasons. I don't have the regulations in front of me, so I can't read out the exact wording of that. As with all things, whether a particular exemption will apply or not in a particular case can often depend on the circumstances of the case. So if Claire Baker is asking about this for a constituent in a particular set of circumstances, if she wants to send us those circumstances, we can give a bespoke answer as opposed to a general answer. But there is a general exemption in the regulations around medical treatment.
John Scott, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, amongst all the goodwill that you speak of towards the business sector, one part of that community has slipped through the cracks, namely the bed and breakfast sector. This sector is struggling hugely and badly needing targeted support. Will you look at this problem again and see if a way can be found of supporting this sector, so important for my constituents in Ayr, Prestwick and Troon and elsewhere?
First Minister.
I'm happy to take this away and talk both to the Finance Secretary and the Tourism Secretary. I know Fergus Ewing, in the latter capacity, has been very assiduous in making sure that we try to cater for the many different aspects of the tourist industry, and self-catering, bed and breakfast in particular, have been a sector that we have sought to do that. But I'll certainly take it away and see whether there's more we can do, if there's a particular gap there that we've yet to fill, and what we can do to try to fill it.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The First Minister talked about the ambition to move most of Scotland out of level 4 towards the end of April. You'll recall that Orkney and Shetland remain in level 3, and my constituents would be very interested to know what the government's intentions are in relation to restrictions in our islands, and also in terms of the business support that she's confirmed will remain in place to the end of June, whether that will similarly be available to businesses in Orkney and Shetland that have been as adversely impacted as those in mainland Scotland.
First Minister.
So, without saying this with absolute certainty at this stage, at that end of April point, as the parts of the country, all of the mainland and certain other parts of the country in level 4 come down to level 3, we would also certainly be hopeful that those parts of the country, Orkney and Shetland, for example, in level 3, would also be able to come down a level. That's the advantage of going back to that level system. But we would also be seeking to make sure that business support, because as I don't need to tell the member, even parts of the country that have slightly greater freedom at the moment are impacted by the inability of other people to travel there, so trading is restricted. So the continuation of business support there will be very important as well.
Finally, Neil Findlay.
The latest official statistics released by the National Records Office of Scotland show that the death rate amongst homeless people is 3 times higher than in England. As we come out of lockdown, what is the plan for all those homeless people who currently sit in temporary accommodation? And can the First Minister advise if a £100 million cut in the social housing budget will help the situation or make it worse?
First Minister.
We're investing in the social and affordable housing budget across this Parliament in a way that is delivering record numbers of new housing. We want to do more. We will do whatever we can within this budget, and if we are still in government, future budgets, to make sure we maximise our housing investment. In terms of the deaths of people homeless, Aileen Campbell reported on these statistics to Cabinet this morning. We had a pre-existing plan of work focused very much on the housing first approach to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. That work has continued and in many respects has been accelerated during the pandemic, and we'll need to have that very firm focus as we come out of the pandemic. And the recommendations of the Homelessness Task Force will be taken forward as we do. We don't want anybody going back to rough sleeping as we come out of the pandemic.
Thank you very much. That concludes questions on the First Minister's statement, and we will move on in a moment to the next item of business.
Colleagues, Jackie Bailey.
Of order, presiding officer, I waited till you returned to your place before doing so, and I apologise for not giving you notice, but I have been reflecting on the previous points of order by my colleague Neil Finlay. I appreciate how difficult this situation is for the corporate body, but it's been publicly reported that the Crown Office wrote to the Scottish Parliament last night threatening the Parliament with contempt of court action on the publication of Alex Salmond's evidence. Given that the Lord Advocate is in charge of the Crown Office and a member of the government, he should be invited to make an urgent statement to this Parliament. And given the significant public interest, will the presiding officer publish the letter from the Crown Office to the Parliament so we understand the restrictions placed on the corporate body?
Can I thank Jackie Bailey for the point of order. And can I first of all say that I recognise the frustration that members express and feel across the chamber. I am aware that most members will not be aware of the full context of this matter, because it is a matter of great confidentiality. Therefore, I will not comment on it specifically. However, I will certainly bear the request for an urgent statement in mind, and I will consult with colleagues on the Bureau. And I believe I've also had a request for an urgent question, which I'll also have a chance to consider later. Thank you very much, colleagues. We're going to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 24196 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Heat Networks Bill. Colleagues, we're just going to have a slight pause. I think we were all set up to move that motion, but the point of order possibly disrupted matters. Just a slight pause. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm going to call on the Minister for Parliament, Graham Day, on behalf of the Bureau, to move the timetable, timetable motion 24196, setting out a timetable for Stage 3 consideration of the Heat Networks Bill.
Forgive my forgetfulness. Moved.
Thank you very much. No members indicated they would speak against the motion. Are we agreed? Sorry, the question is that motion 24196 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. So, colleagues, the next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the Heat Networks Scotland Bill. So, in dealing with amendments, members should have with them the bill as amended at Stage 2, the marshalled list and the grouping of amendments. As usual, the division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon, and there will be a 1-minute vote on any division. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of motions should press the request to speak buttons as soon as I call the group. And we'll now turn to the marshalled list. So, on Group 1, can I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, in a group on its own? Minister to move and speak to Amendment 5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Part 1 of the bill creates a licensing system for those who are supplying thermal energy by means of a heat network. This is crucial as it will ensure that those who are supplying the essential service of heat, and in some cases hot water, via a heat network are solvent, skilled and fit and proper persons. We'll also provide for the imposition of conditions of a licence so that networks are developed and maintained to the highest standards. As such, Section 2 of the bill makes it an offence to supply thermal energy via a heat network without a licence. On reflection, however, I believe that it would be appropriate to insert a reasonable excuse defence for this offence, and this is what Amendment 5 would do. In allowing for a defence of reasonable excuse, we would ensure that, for example, we're not penalising persons in the event that a company reorganisation inadvertently means that the licence is no longer in the name of the company supplying heat. There may be other cases where a specific set of circumstances mean that an offence is unintentionally committed. It would, of course, be for the courts to determine what is a reasonable excuse for supplying thermal energy by a heat network without a licence. At this stage, however, I trust that members agree that rather than creating a strict liability offence, it is proportionate to allow a defence to be made where it can be shown that the person in question has a reasonable excuse. I move Amendment 5.
Thank you, Minister. And no other member has indicated they wish to contribute. I take it the Minister has nothing further to add. So the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Group 2? This is on the Just Transition Principles. Can I call Amendment 3 in the name of Claudia Beamish, grouped with Amendment 4? Claudia Beamish to move Amendment 3 and speak to both amendments in this group. Sorry, is it Mr Rowley instead of Claudia Beamish? I beg your pardon, I should have. Mr Rowley, Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This group of amendments seeks to embed the Just Transition Principles throughout the bill. The two amendments refer to Just Transition Principles as set out in Section 35C of the Climate Change Act. These describe the importance of equity and action taken to reduce net Scottish emissions of greenhouse gases, and in short require that this is done in a way that supports sustainable jobs, low carbon investment and infrastructure, engages with workers, trade unions, communities and others, creates decent and high valued work and contributes to sustainable economic approaches which help to address inequality and poverty. Amendment 2 adds to Section 5.3 and 4 of the bill, which provides that the licensing authority may only grant a licence application if it is satisfied that the applicant has the ability to perform the licence activities and requires the licensing authority to have regard to certain matters so far as relevant in making this assessment. The amendment adds to these the applicant's ability to operate a heat network in a manner that takes account of the Just Transition Principles. Amendment 3 adds to Section 76A on the Heat Networks Delivery Plan. The amendment would require the Just Transition Principles to be considered by Scottish ministers when preparing, reviewing and revising the Heat Networks Delivery Plan and when reporting to Parliament on the plan. By embedding the Just Transition into these stages at the heart of the network development, it ensures that the benefits of these networks will not come at the expense of equity and, in fact, all the multi-benefits and opportunities for local people can be seized. The shortcomings of capturing fair work in the renewable industry have been clear to see, so getting these principles into the face of the bill is meaningful. Claudia Beamish appreciated being able to refine these amendments in discussions with the Minister Paul Wheelhouse between stages 2 and 3. Securing the just transition remains the key goal of Claudia Beamish and indeed the Labour Party in Scotland. Every step on the journey to a net zero emissions economy should be tested against these principles of equity. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. And can I call the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2019, the Climate Change Scotland Act was amended to enshrine in law our commitment to transitioning to net zero in line with the Just Transition Principles. Those principles set out the importance of taking action to reduce net Scottish emissions of greenhouse gases in a way which supports sustainable jobs, low carbon investment, develops and maintains social consensus, creates fair and high value work and contributes to sustainable economic approaches that help to address inequality and poverty, as Mr Rowley has set out. Our commitment to these principles is unwavering, and the Just Transition Principles are at the heart of our green recovery towards a fairer, greener, more prosperous Scotland. So it's right that in lodging Amendments 3 and 4, Claudia Beamish asked Parliament to consider how the principles may be applied to the development of the heat network sector. I note that in its interim report, the Just Transition Commission highlighted a heat network in Aberdeen as a good example of what's possible when equity is considered alongside the need to reduce emissions. So I'm happy to support Ms Beamish's amendments, having discussed this with Ms Beamish prior to and since stage 2, as Mr Rowley has set out, and would ask members to also support them. So that these principles inform the licensing system and as we plan for the long-term and large-scale delivery of heat networks across Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. And can I ask Mr Rowley if he has any further comments to add? That's fine. In that case, we'll move straight to the vote, and the question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And we turn now to Group 3. This is on standards of service by licence holders. Can I call Amendment 50 in the name of Alexander Burnett in a group on its own? Alexander, to move and speak to Amendment 50.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. My amendment in this group and the subsequent one relate to clarity and guidance for licence holders, the points of which are on the record during stage 2, so I see no reason to no need to repeat them now. They weren't pressed at that stage to improve on the definitions, to make them compatible with the rest of the bill, and I'm grateful to the Minister and his team for assisting me in achieving that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Wheelhouse. And I call the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me start again by thanking Alexander Burnett for positive engagement on this matter. As he indicated at stage 2, as a general principle, we have tried to avoid putting standard conditions on the face of the bill. The main reason for that is that need to retain flexibility and ensure that whoever the licensing authority is in the future, they have the ability to shape the licence conditions as required. However, I do recognise the desire to have a reference to standards of service being specified on the face of the bill, and the amendment lodged by Mr Burnett will ensure that standards of service are clearly set out as a matter which the standard conditions may make provision for. So I'm happy to support Mr Burnett's amendments, as I trust this clarity will help developers, and I would encourage colleagues across the chamber to also support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does Mr Burnett wish to add any comments? Thank you very much. We'll go straight to the question. The question is that Amendment 50 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Turning now to Group 4. This is on guidance to licensing authority. Can I call Amendment 1 in the name of Maurice Golden, grouped with Amendments 2 and 51? Maurice Golden to move Amendment 1 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Thank you. I'd like to move Amendment 1. I'd like to thank the Minister and his officials for working with me on this amendment and Amendment 2. The bill currently provides that Scottish ministers may issue guidance to the licensing authority about the exercise of its functions under Part 1. Subsection 2 provides that the guidance may in particular relate to matters in Section 5(4), which concern matters for the licensing authority to have regard to in assessing an applicant's ability to perform activities that would be authorised by the licence. The proposed amendments would specify that the guidance may also in particular relate to how functions of the licensing authority should be fulfilled in relation to the supply of thermal energy by means of existing heat networks. In terms of these provisions, ministers may give the licensing authority guidance about the way in which their functions in relation to the licensing of the supply of thermal energy by existing heat networks should be carried out. These functions include how applications for licences are to be considered and the nature of both standard conditions and other conditions which may be imposed, excluded or modified. The guidance would be able to define what is considered to be an existing heat network for the purpose of such guidance. The licensing authority must have regard to any guidance issued. Any guidance issued would also be published. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Golden. And could I call Alexander Burnett to speak to Amendment 51 and the other amendments in this group? No comments to me. Could I, in that case, call the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Maurice Golden and Alexander Burnett for working with me since stage 2 to introduce these amendments today. Turning firstly to Mr Golden's amendments, which concern the important matter about how the implementation of this bill would affect existing heat networks, of which we estimate there are around 1,080 across Scotland. I know that those operating schemes today are eager to know, for example, whether they would have to obtain a licence and what might happen should such an application be refused. The Competition and Markets Authority has been clear that regulation of the heat network sector is required, and the licensing regime in the bill will also provide the mechanism for decarbonising this sector. At this stage, I cannot provide the concrete guarantees that existing operators and developers seek about how they will be affected by the bill. However, I can assure them that we will work with them as we develop secondary legislation to put in place the full regulatory framework provided for in this bill to ensure that the system is proportionate and that impacts are properly understood and mitigated as appropriate. There are mechanisms already in the bill which allow exemptions to be made under Section 3 from the requirement to hold a heat network's licence, the ability to apply licence conditions or special conditions to only certain licences under Sections 6 and 8, and for application fees to be modified in Section 77. These provisions provide the flexibility required to implement appropriate transitional arrangements or to create exceptions if it's considered appropriate. Mr Golden's Amendments 1 and 2 provide further reassurance to operators of existing heat networks by specifying in primary legislation that guidance issued to the licensing authority may include guidance on how the licensing authority are to exercise their functions in relation to existing heat networks. This is a welcome and proportionate change to the bill, and I am happy to offer my support for these amendments, and I ask members to do the same. Turning now to Mr Burnett's amendment, I believe we are seeing the, the benefit of having a member who's experienced in the development and operation of heat networks take part in the bill. It's one of the strengths of the Parliament, presiding officer. We have lots of experience across the chamber. And I understand that clarity is needed on how licensing authority is to reach its decisions and the expectations that operators can have about their dialogue with the licensing authority. So Amendment 51 recognises that guidance is the most appropriate place to deal with these issues. So again, I am happy to support this approach, and again ask members to support Mr Burnett's amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Does Mr Golden wish to add anything by way of conclusion? Thank you. So we'll go straight to the vote. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 2, Maurice Golden, to move?
Moved.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 51, Alexander Burnett, to move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 51 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Turning to Group 5 now, this is on minor and technical amendments. Can I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 7, 54, 44, 47 and 48. Minister, to move Amendment 6 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This group, as you say, deals with very minor drafting amendments, and I would therefore keep my comments as brief as they can be in describing them. Firstly, as a result of amendments at Stage 2, Section 17 of the Bill contains sub-paragraphs A and B, and we want to adjust that. Amendment 6 will therefore change paragraph A of subsection 2 into subsection 2 itself, and Amendment 7 will change paragraph B of subsection 2 into a new subsection 3. Amendments 47 and 48 are consequential on Amendments 6 and 7. They change the cross-references in subsections 1 and 2 of Section 83 to the definitions in Section 17. Amendment 54 takes account of an amendment that was passed at Stage 2, which enabled local authorities to become consent authorities. At that time, a consequential amendment was made to Section 77, subsection 1, that enabled provision to be made about the recovery of administrative costs by local authorities. It's also necessary to modify Section 77, subsection 4, to clarify that local authorities do not have to consider heat network consent applications where any applicable fee has not been paid. Finally, Presiding Officer, an amendment was also passed at Stage 2 to insert a new Section 61B about compensation that may be paid in the event that a network wayleave right is varied. This was done in recognition that a licence holder may, in future, need to modify the right that it is secured, which could in turn give rise to the need to compensate the landowner or occupier. The detailed provisions about the payment of any compensation is to be made by regulations. Amendment 44 would modify Section 81 to provide that any regulations about the payment of this compensation under subsection 4 of Section 61B are subject to the affirmative procedure. This would provide consistency with the procedure to be used for other regulations about compensation throughout the bill. So I move Amendment 6 and I urge members to support the other amendments in the group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And there are no other colleagues who wish to speak in this group, so we'll go straight to the vote. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we agreed? We are agreed. I call Amendment 7, Minister, to move formally.
Formally move to convene.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. We're turning to Group 6 now, Local Authority as Heat Network Consent Authority. Can I call Amendment 8 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 8A, 9, 10, 43 and 46. Minister, to move Amendment 8 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The role of local authorities in the regulatory system for heat networks, particularly in granting consent to the development and operation of networks, has been a major theme during the passage of the bill. When we first consulted on a heat network consent system, we recognised that local authorities may be well placed to take on this function, given that they already act as planning authorities and because heat networks are local assets by their nature. However, as we further developed our proposals, it became clear that heat networks would not be developed uniformly across Scotland, meaning some, potentially many, local authorities would be required to invest in a function that went underutilised. Instead, we sought to maximise use of the capacity and expertise already available within the Scottish Government's Energy Consents Unit, which already scrutinises renewables and electricity transmission projects. As such, the bill, as introduced, placed the responsibility for administering heat network consents on the Scottish Ministers. Following constructive Stage 1 debate, however, I agreed with the Energy, Economy and Fair Work Committee's recommendation in its Stage 1 report that the bill should be amended to include provision so that responsibility for consent could move to local authorities in the future. With the committee's support, amendments were passed at Stage 2 that enable those local authorities who wish to be empowered with this responsibility to become a consent authority, while ensuring that the Scottish Government can carry this function out elsewhere in Scotland where necessary. I've kept in touch with committee members on this issue since Stage 2, in particular Andy Whiteman, and have come to a consensus that Part 2 of the bill could be refined further so as to empower local authorities to take on the role of the consent authority. Amendment 8 therefore amends Section 18A to provide that if a local authority makes a written request to Scottish ministers to become the consent authority for its area, the Scottish ministers are then required to make the necessary regulations within 6 months. Presiding Officer, Mr Whiteman has also lodged an amendment of Amendment 8. Amendment 8A rightly recognises that having made a written request under Amendment 8 to become the consent authority for its area, a local authority may later change its mind and decide that it does not wish to become the consent authority. Mr Whiteman's amendment provides for this and recognises that where a local authority withdraws its written request, the Scottish ministers are no longer required to make regulations under Section 18A, subsection 1 in relation to that local authority. And I'm happy to support Mr Whiteman's Amendment 8A. Amendment 9 replaces the existing subsection 3 of Section 18A with an identical obligation to consult the affected local authority and any other appropriate person before making regulations under subsection 1. The drafting is adjusted in light of Amendment 43, which will alter the parliamentary procedure. Amendment 10 is a technical amendment setting out that where the regulations are subject to the affirmative procedure, as they textually amend the Act, the references in the section to the making of regulations is to be read as references to laying draft regulations before this Parliament. Given that Amendment 8 would empower local authorities to request to be designated as the consent authority for its area, Amendment 43 removes those designation regulations from the list of powers which are always subject to the affirmative procedure. So regulations designating a local authority as a consent authority for its area would be subject to the negative procedure unless the designation regulations add to, omit or remove text from an Act. In that case, Amendment 46 provides for regulations to be subject to the affirmative procedure. So I move Amendment 8. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And could I call Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 8A and speak to all the amendments in this group?
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 8A. Since the bill was introduced, I have sought to strengthen the powers of local government in it. It is ironic that a bill whose drafting was influenced by the Danish experience should have had so little role for local government, given that Denmark's municipalities, much smaller units of local government than ours, have exclusive jurisdiction over the consenting regime and also play a significant role, together with cooperatives, in the ownership of the pipe network. The committee's Stage 1 report noted this, and I was pleased that the Minister introduced amendments to allow for the transfer of powers to local government by regulation. I lodged amendments at Stage 2 that would have given a clear timescale to this, and I'm grateful for Graham Simpson for having spoken to them, myself having had to be in attendance at another committee at that same moment. Quite rightly, he did not press them on my behalf, given that the Minister committed to work with me at Stage 3. And so I wish to thank the Minister for his constructive engagement, welcome the amendments in his name in this group, particularly Amendment 8, which gives local authorities the right, the statutory right, to request and be granted consenting rights. And this is an elegant solution, I think, and one that reflects that not all local authorities will want these powers at the same time. My Amendment 8A is minor but important, and as the Minister said himself, it ensures that where a request is made under the provisions of Amendment 8, a local authority can withdraw that request should circumstances change from the date upon which the request was made. It covers, therefore, an unlikely scenario, but provides additional flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Whiteman. And can I ask if the Minister wishes to add any further comments? We'll go straight to the vote. The question is that Amendment 8A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Minister, to press or withdraw Amendment 8 as amended.
Formally moved.
Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 8 as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Can I call Amendment 9 in the name of the Minister? Minister to move.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 10, Minister to move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. We move now to Group 7. This is on heat network consent enforcement. Can I call Amendment 11 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 and 19. Minister to move Amendment 11 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These amendments that I've lodged in this group are largely technical in nature, but do provide important clarity about the enforcement action in relation to heat network consents. Amendment 11 modifies Section 30, so it's clear that the Enforcement Authority is able to issue an enforcement notice to both persons who are constructing or operating a heat network on their own behalf without consent, and persons who are constructing or operating a heat network on behalf of another without that other person holding a heat network consent. Separately, the current provision of Section 30, subsection 1b, which allows enforcement action to be taken against a consent holder where there is a failure to comply with a condition or limitation of the consent, becomes, with some minor modifications, the new subsection 1a. Amendment 12 is then a technical amendment which is consequential to Amendment 11. It simplifies Section 30, subsection 4a, by providing that an enforcement notice must set out the reasons why the Enforcement Authority has issued it. Amendments 13 and 14 are minor amendments which reflect the changes to Section 17 made at Stage 2. They simplify paragraphs A and B of subsection 5 of Section 30 to refer to compliance with or failure to comply with Section 17 subsection 1. Section 17 subsection 1, as amended at Stage 2, now includes both an obligation to hold a heat network licence and an obligation to comply with conditions or limitations of a consent. Amendment 15 removes Section 30, subsection 8, which is no longer applicable, given the changes to be made by Amendment 11. Amendment 16 provides a definition of enforcement notice in Section 30 for the purposes of Part 2 of the Bill, and as a result, it's no longer necessary to provide this definition within Section 36, and an Amendment 19 therefore removes that section. Amendment 18 alters Section 33, subsection 3, to provide persons with a further defence against the offence of non-compliance with an enforcement notice, namely the offence of reasonable excuse, for failing to ensure the taking of steps or the cessation of activities specified in the notice. Amendment 17 is a technical change to signify new paragraphing of the existing text of Section 33, subsection 3, in consequence of Amendment 18. Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 11 and I urge members to support the other amendments in this group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And no other members indicated they wish to speak, so we'll go straight to the question. The question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendments 12 to 19 and invite the Minister to move the amendments en bloc?
Moved en bloc, President.
Thank you. Does any member object if I put a single question on Amendments 12 to 19? No. Good. In that case, the question is that Amendments 12 to 19 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. We turn now to Group 8. This is on heat network zoning by local authorities. Can I call Amendment 20 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 and 28. Minister to move Amendment 20 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I apologise in advance. This is one of my longer contributions. I will keep my remarks in this group as brief as I can do, mainly relating to amendments lodged by Mark Ruskell, which I have discussed with Mr Ruskell. To start with, I would like to highlight that heat network zoning is probably one of the highest priority measures for stakeholders. This legislation is the first of its kind in the United Kingdom, and we already know that stakeholders such as the Association for Decentralised Energy are calling on the UK Government to go in the same direction as we have set out in Scotland. That is because it will bring certainty to local heat planning and empowers local authorities to ensure that heat network opportunities are visible to potential investors and to local communities as well. Presiding Officer, heat network zoning by local authorities, as introduced under this bill, refers to two aspects: a duty on local authorities to review heat network zoning in their area under Section 38, and a power to designate such zones under Section 37. Amendment 20 that I have brought forward is a technical amendment to clarify that a local authority may exercise its power under Section 37, subsection 1, to designate an area as a heat network zone at any time without having to carry out a review under Section 38 beforehand. I felt that making this small change recognises that those local authorities who have a good picture of opportunities within their area may move directly to the final designation of the zones without having to carry out a review under Section 38 first. It also complements the amendments that have been introduced by Mark Ruskell that I would like to now turn to. Firstly, let me thank Mr Ruskell for positive engagement ahead of Stage 3. I'm grateful for that. I understand that the underlying intention of his amendments is to maximise instances where heat network zones are designated, which will in turn help grow the sector. Without going into too much detail, Amendment 21 would oblige local authorities to carry out a review under Section 38, subsection 1, to consider whether one or more areas in its area is likely to be particularly suitable for the construction and operation of a heat network. Amendment 23 would strengthen the provisions in relation to the next steps to be taken by a local authority following the carrying out of such a review. The amendment provides that should this review find that an area is likely to be particularly suitable for the construction and operation of a heat network, then the local authority may either proceed to consider itself whether to designate the area or areas as a heat network zone, or alternatively request that Scottish ministers consider whether to designate the area or areas as a heat network zone. Amendment 24 would remove the option of doing nothing following review as currently specified in section 38, subsection 3b. So I believe this strengthens action to deliver heat networks. In carrying out reviews to determine whether an area is likely to be particularly suitable for the construction and operation of a heat network, Amendment 22 requires local authorities to consider the matters mentioned in section 39, subsection 1, including, for example, fuel poverty. Amendment 28 enables the Scottish ministers to issue guidance to local authorities about reviews carried out under section 38, subsection 1, which could include a definition of what is understood by, and I quote, particularly suitable for the construction and operation of a heat network, unquote. Amendment 25 relates to the statement that a local authority must publish following the heat network zoning review. It specifies that what such statements must set out, which includes setting out reasons for the outcomes of the review, identifying an area by reference to a map where it's considered to be suitable for designation as a heat network zone, and providing reasons for the local authority's decision to either proceed to consider designation itself or referring the matter to the Scottish ministers to consider designation. Amendment 26 makes a minor drafting change to the list of additional matters relating to reviews that may be specified by Scottish ministers in consequence, Amendment 25. Presiding Officer, at stage 2, I highlighted my concern that Mark Ruskell's original amendments in this area would remove the degree of choice for local authorities following the first step of the review. However, I am now content that with all of the proposed amendments and confirm that they work within the wider context of the bill, the degree of choice is retained by maintaining the option to request Scottish ministers to undertake the designation on behalf of a local authority. And having discussed this approach with Mark Ruskell, I'm happy to support his amendments as they'll ensure the heat network zones are being designated where there is a clear opportunity identified. Heat network zones, as I mentioned before, are a key piece of the puzzle which unlocks other elements of this bill, such as heat network zone permits that are aimed at increasing deployment of this technology across Scotland. They also provide a useful reference point for other policy areas such as building standards, planning and non-domestic rates that can be used to further drive connections to heat networks within heat network zones. Making sure that these heat network zones are designated at the earliest opportunity will unlock all these opportunities and give us a better picture of the potential for this technology to help us on our journey to net zero. Presiding Officer, Mark Ruskell's amendments have been developed constructively and collaboratively and strengthen the bill and will have a real impact on deployment in Scotland. So I am happy to support each of his amendments in this group and encourage other members to do the same. So I move Amendment 20 in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And can I call Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 21 and the other amendments in this group?
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Happy to do so. And can I certainly acknowledge the creative and constructive discussion with the Minister and the Bill team in between Stage 2 and Stage 3. And I think the amendments that are presented here today are the outcome of that. I won't go into all the detail of the amendments. I think the Minister's already done that. But what I will say is that all stakeholders need a really clear signal that areas that have been assessed as particularly suitable for the construction of a heat network will not be unduly held back in that designation. And I think it was commented in evidence that I read at Stage 1 that we don't want a situation where there are lots and lots of really positive feasibility studies being produced about heat networks, but there's actually very little action happening on the ground. So the work to designate heat network zones that are suitable must progress. And if local authorities are not in a position to drive that forward themselves, then under my amendments, they have the clear option to request ministers to do so instead. But, holding back on designation when areas have been assessed as suitable should not really be an option. And under my amendments in this grouping, they won't be. So can I thank the Minister again for constructive engagement with this and hope that the Chamber will vote for these.
Thank you very much, Mr Ruskell. So we'll go straight to the first question. The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 21 in the name of Mark Ruskell to move?
Moved.
Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 22, Mark Ruskell to move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 23? Mark Ruskell to move.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Can I... Yes. Can I call Amendment 24? Mark Ruskell to move.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Can I call Amendment 25 and Mark Ruskell to move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 26, Mark Ruskell to move?
Moved.
Moved. I'm ahead of myself. The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are all agreed. And we turn now to Group 9, Targets and Reporting. Can I call Amendment 27 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 37, 38, 39, 40, 52, 41, 42, 53, 45, 55 and 49. Minister, to move Amendment 27 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And again, I apologise, this is one of the more lengthy contributions. At stage 2 of this bill was amended to include new provisions in relation to the heat network supply targets by Mark Ruskell and Maurice Golden. Maurice Golden also inserted provision requiring Scottish ministers to produce a heat networks delivery plan relating to the increased deployment and use of heat networks. In essence, these amendments aim to provide clear signalling to the market that it's due to develop further following the establishment of regulatory framework under this bill, and to make the Scottish ministers more accountable for the delivery of the overall aim of this bill to achieve the greater deployment of heat networks in Scotland. Although I had some reservations in relation to the evidence used to produce some of the targets, having discussed this matter with members, I am happy to embrace the challenge that statutory targets in relation to heat network deployment bring. And we've always had the ambition, of course, for heat networks to deploy more significantly in Scotland, and indeed targets would make that more certain, I believe. To ensure that the bill is clear in this matter, it's necessary to reconcile the provisions on heat network supply targets and the heat networks delivery plan. And that's why, Presiding Officer, I brought forward a number of amendments that will help achieve this. Amendment 27 is a consequential on various amendments in this group and adjusts a reference to heat network targets in section 39. Amendments 37, 38, 39 and 42 relate to reporting requirements in the heat networks delivery plan in section 76A. Amendment 37 ties the reporting requirements in relation to heat network supply targets with the heat networks delivery plan by providing that the plan sets out how the Scottish ministers propose to meet the targets specified in section 76C subsection 1. We felt that the alignment of the reporting requirements that both had 2 yearly reporting cycles and were required to be laid before Parliament would optimise use of parliamentary time and provide a fuller picture on the state of the heat network sector to Parliament. Amendment 38 further provides that any report laid before the Scottish Parliament by the Scottish ministers following a review of the heat networks delivery plan must consider what progress has been made in meeting the targets specified in section 76C subsection 1. Amendment 42 removes subsections 2 to 4 of section 76C, which relate to the delivery plan and reporting requirements regarding targets, as these will now be covered in section 76A. Amendment 39 moves section 76A itself so that it follows section 76C, which relates to the heat network supply targets. And amendments 40 and 41 essentially combine the existing sections 76B and 76C, which both relate to the targets, into a single section, but with some modifications. Amendment 40 leaves out section 76B. Amendment 41 inserts 2 regulation-making powers in section 76C, which are akin to the powers in section 76B. The first follows the Scottish ministers, allows the Scottish ministers to specify by regulations an additional target relating to the supply of thermal energy by heat networks in Scotland, but also to modify any target for the time being specified in section 76C, subsection 1. The second power allows the Scottish ministers by regulations to make provision about targets specified or modified under that power. And Amendment 45 provides that regulations specifying additional targets or which modify existing targets are subject to the affirmative procedure. Amendment 49 is technical and makes a change to the long title to properly reflect that the bill also sets targets relating to the supply of thermal energy by heat networks and the delivery plan relating to the increased use of heat networks. Presiding Officer, we feel that these changes were necessary to tidy up provisions of the bill following stage 2. Additionally, Scottish ministers taking the power to amend the targets as set out on the face of the bill will ensure that once there is better evidence through the upcoming National Comprehensive Assessment and designation of heat network zones, future administrations will be able to update these targets if required by regulation with the full scrutiny of Parliament in doing so. We have good reasons to believe the potential for heat networks in Scotland is substantial and that these powers will be used to ensure we are ambitious. Presiding Officer, other amendments in this group have been lodged by Maurice Golden and Mark Ruskell, who engaged very constructively with me and my officials prior to stage 3. And without preempting their input to this discussion, I would like to thank them for these constructive contributions and offer a few comments. Firstly, I would like to turn to Amendment 52, brought forward by Maurice Golden, to adjust the target for combined supply of thermal energy by heat networks in Scotland to reach 2 terawatt-hours of output by 2025. So the target is instead to reach 2.6 terawatt-hours of output by 2027. The regulatory system that we put in place by this bill provides the structure for growth of the market to ensure that heat networks in Scotland are developed in appropriate places to a high standard, provide low and zero carbon heat to end users and provide high levels of service. We anticipate that this system will be operational from 2023 and therefore a target to be achieved by 2025 could carry a risk that a rapid deployment of heat networks needed to meet it would result in heat networks developed to poor standards in inappropriate places and with no controls in place to ensure that they are low or zero carbon. The target proposed by Maurice Golden of 2.6 terawatt-hours of output by 2077 has arisen from discussions with himself and Mr Ruskell and allows more time for the regulatory system to bed in and ensure that the supply chain develops to deliver this important challenge. It's by no means less ambitious, and I want to stress that. In fact, Presiding Officer, Scotland currently has approximately 34,000 homes connected to heat networks that, alongside non-domestic connections, amount to 1.2 terawatt-hours of existing supply. To demonstrate the scale of the challenge, we estimate that if the deployment was linear, the equivalent of 20,000 homes will need to be connected to a heat network every year from 2021 to achieve the 2027 target set out by this new amendment. To put it into further context, the Queen's Quay heat network in Clydebank, which currently supplies a health centre and a care home with heat generated from the River Clyde, hopes in time to expand to connect approximately 1,000 homes and 500,000 square feet of commercial space. The heat network at Queen's Quay is one of the most ambitious in Scotland and has taken 5 years from concept to operation. Heat networks are large-scale infrastructure projects, and as such, they take time to plan, to develop and commission. Maurice Golden's amendment will provide more time and space to identify and develop appropriate sited low or zero carbon heat networks, and as such, it is very welcome. Amendments 53 and 55, introduced by Mark Ruskell, are another welcome addition to the bill that further strengthens it as we seek to achieve our 2045 net zero target. It places a duty on Scottish ministers to lay regulations by October 2023 that set an additional target relating to the output from the combined supply of thermal energy by heat networks in Scotland to be reached by 2035, and such regulations will be subject to the affirmative procedure. Not only does this enable the Scottish ministers to take account of best evidence provided by initial heat network zoning, but it will also enable a clear pathway into the future, giving longer-term certainty to local supply chains and driving innovation to identify and deliver further opportunities in the sector. Together with a strengthened heat network zones framework, this long-term target will provide a strong signal to investors and the supply chain that Scotland is a good place for their business. To sum up, Presiding Officer, I'd like to encourage members to vote for all the amendments in this group as they provide an ambitious but balanced commitment. They signal that Scotland is serious about its commitment to providing low and zero carbon heating to our buildings, and I move Amendment 27 in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And can I call Maurice Golden to speak to Amendment 52 and the other amendments in this group?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Amendment 52 seeks to update Amendment 155 from Stage 2. It will introduce a clearly defined delivery target for 2027 of 2.6 terawatt-hours. And we know decarbonising heat will be a big step in reaching net zero in Scotland. And one of the stated aims of the bill is to develop the low-carbon heat networks needed to do that. But without delivery targets, we have no way of assessing the pace or quality of development taking place. That is why the target cited in the amendment follows research from Scottish Renewables, and it is broadly in line with industry growth estimates. They represent a more than doubling of output from current levels by 2027, and they will allow us to ensure we are on track and that heat is playing its part in reaching our 2045 net zero goal. I welcome other amendments in this group and look forward to Scotland achieving these ambitious targets.
Thank you very much, Mr Golden. And can I call on Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 53 and the other amendments in this group?
Yeah, thanks, Presiding Officer. Happy to speak to 53 and others. I mean, again, I think, constructive discussions in between stage 2 and stage 3, and I think taken together, the amendments in this group will set a much better framework for target setting going forward. I think we all acknowledge that targets are important. We've seen that in relation to renewable electricity, but they can also be prone to either overshooting or undershooting if they don't have a solid technical basis behind them. So I think, the terawatt hours targets that were inserted by Maurice Golden's amendment stage 2 were very welcome. But the 2025 target perhaps didn't fully align with the tools that the bill will make available to deliver in that timescale. And I think, the Minister's already mentioned perhaps what could have been an unintended consequence to that, which is that heat networks get built quickly, but they're connected to gas. So we have another dash for gas, and that wouldn't be great in terms of carbon. So I think the 2027 target that's amended here, although it's 2 years later, it does match the same trajectory as the 2025 and the 2030 targets. And it does set a really clear and achievable medium-term goal for the industry. So I think it's the right approach. In terms of my own amendments, at the other end of the scale, there's a danger that we don't set targets far enough into the future to deliver that long-term certainty needed for investment. So setting a clear expectation in this bill that there will be a robust 2035 target for heat networks, I think is really important. And I think just sort of thinking back to some of the work we're doing in the Environment Committee at the moment on the Climate Change Plan update, we can see in the current Climate Change Plan that there is a flatlining of ambition as we head towards 2030 in a number of the sectors. And I think where bottom-up targets can be set within sectors like this, that will put more solid blocks of ambition into the full climate change plan when that comes up for a full review in 2023. So I think it's important in terms of drive, where we've got certainty, let's build that into the climate change plan that we can be ambitious and build from there. And October 23 is the date in my Amendment 53 here. That's the date to set the target for 2035. So it will come at a good time when we'll be looking at the climate change plan in its entirety. And it means that that 2035 target will be set on the back of a national comprehensive assessment that will draw together all the detailed work on heat zones that will be coming from the councils. It will deliver that certainty in a robust, and I hope a very ambitious way going forward as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr Ruskell. Does the Minister wish to add any comments?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll move straight to the vote. The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 28, Mark Ruskell, to move? This was the previous group.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. We're turning now to Group 10. Heat network permits, requirement for permit and enforcement. Can I call Amendment 29 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 30, 31, 32, 33 and 34. Minister to move Amendment 29 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The amendments I've lodged in this group are largely technical matters that have been identified by us following review of the bill after stage 2. Firstly, a notice under section 47, subsection 1, prohibits, unless an exemption applies, the operation of a heat network within the heat network zone designated by the notice, without a heat network zone permit for that zone. Amendment 29 modifies section 47, subsection 1 in order to ensure that those operating a heat network on behalf of a heat network permit holder may do so without themselves having to hold a permit as well. Amendment 30 places the exemptions from the prohibition into section 47. These exemptions are essentially those currently within the criminal offence provision in section 51. The exemption from the need to hold a heat network zone permit to operate a heat network within a designated zone apply in terms of new subsections 1A and 1B if a person is entitled to operate the heat network immediately before the zone is designated by a notice under section 47 subsection 1. This means that where at the time of designating a zone a person already holds consent to operate the heat network or is exempt from the need to hold a consent, then they are to be exempt from the requirement to hold a heat network zone permit in order to operate the heat network. Amendment 31 is a consequential amendment and simply provides that a heat network zone permit is defined as one issued by the permit authority. Amendment 32 replaces the existing subsections 1 to 3 of section 51 as the exemptions they contain are now moved to section 47 by Amendment 30 that I described earlier. New subsections 1 and 1A provide that a person who operates a heat network without holding a heat network zone permit in contravention of a notice which prohibits that operation commits an offence if they do so either on their own behalf or engaging another to do so on their behalf. The amendment also allows for a defence of reasonable excuse against these offences, similar to the provision under Amendment 5 in relation to licences. Amendment 33 is a consequential amendment on Amendment 32 to ensure that the penalty for the offence of operating a heat network in a designated zone without a permit applies whether a person is operating the heat network on their own behalf or another person is acting for them. Finally, Amendment 34 is also consequential to Amendment 32. It removes the definition of a term which is no longer required in light of the drafting changes. So, Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 29 and I urge members to support each of the technical amendments in this group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. The question is that Amendment 29 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call Amendments 30 to 34 and invite the Minister to move the amendments en bloc?
Moved en bloc.
Thank you very much. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 30 to 34? No. So the question is that Amendments 30 to 34 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 11. This is on compulsory purchase Crown land. Can I call Amendment 35 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 36? Minister to move Amendment 35 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to have the opportunity... Oh, sorry, I've skipped ahead on myself, Presiding Officer. Never a good start. We're going so fast. The amendments I've introduced in this group provide how compulsory purchase powers conferred on heat network licence holders under Section 57 may be exercised in relation to Her Majesty's private estates. Section 80 of the Bill already makes provision about the powers of entry onto Crown land as a result of the powers under Sections 34, subsection 2, Section 64, subsection 5 and Section 65, subsection 7. On reflection, I believe it's appropriate that similar provision is made regarding how compulsory purchase powers are to apply to the Queen's private estates. Amendment 35 therefore prohibits the Scottish Ministers from confirming a compulsory purchase order prompted under Section 57 unless the, and I quote, appropriate authority, unquote, consents. The appropriate authority is defined for these purposes as in Section 80 of the Bill. Subject to the consent of the appropriate authority, the amendment continues to permit the use of compulsory purchase order to assemble land for the construction or operation of a heat network. Amendment 36 proceeds to define what is meant by both Her Majesty's private estates and an appropriate authority. Given the technological nature of heat networks, which are dependent on a density of heat demand being adjacent to a source of thermal energy, it's not anticipated that the exercise of compulsory purchase powers in relation to the Queen's private estates will be a common occurrence. Nevertheless, given that licence holders will often be private enterprises rather than public authorities to whom compulsory purchase powers are typically provided, I believe it's appropriate that there is further provision about their application in relation to Her Majesty's private land. So I move Amendment 35 and urge members to support both amendments in this group.
Thank you very much. And I call Andy Whiteman.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I oppose both amendments 35 and 36. Prior to 1862, the monarch was prohibited from owning land in their personal capacity, and the 1862 Act was only passed following the death of Prince Albert to legitimise and allow the private ownership of land in Scotland by the monarch. I have no objection to the Queen in her private capacity owning property, but she cannot, on the one hand, claim rights as a private citizen to private estates, and on the other, to continue to be exempt from the rules which govern the affairs of all other private citizens who own land, most particularly in this respect, the risk that, in the public interest, some of your land may be subject to compulsory purchase order. Presiding Officer, it's long past time that the Crown Private Estates Act 1862 was repealed, and until that day arrives, we should not be seeking to make any exemptions for Her Majesty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr Whiteman, can I call on the Minister if he wishes to make a response?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll keep this brief. I do understand members' concerns around these amendments. However, we have taken care to make it clear that the approach taken in particular to this bill and not an acceptance of a general principle, since it relates to specific nature of heat networks and business models that they often adopt. It's not considered that a precedent is set, and our understanding is that other equivalent provisions have been included before. I do hear what Mr Whiteman is saying, of course, but other provisions have been included before in other acts of the Scottish Parliament. For example, Section section 100, subsection 4 and subsection 5 of the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012 excluded Her Majesty's private estate and indeed other Crown land from compulsory purchase. As previously said, powers of compulsory purchase are more usually conferred on public bodies or bodies with a community purpose, as the compulsory acquisition of land must be in the public interest. Heat network development is likely to be taken forward by the construction of both large and small-scale heat networks. Licence holders therefore cannot necessarily be directly compared with public utilities which provide other services such as gas, electricity or water, and in practice it's probable that many licence holders will be companies created as special purpose vehicles to operate particular heat networks. So we think in these circumstances this amendment is, or set of amendments are required to ensure that we have smooth passage of the bill.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move to the question, and the question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. So we're going to move to a division. Now, this is the first division of the afternoon, so I'm going to suspend proceedings for 5 minutes to call members to the chamber and to allow members online to register as well. So Parliament is suspended for 5 minutes.